some point that what people sometimes refer to as the irrelevance of art is key to art's relevance. And what I mean by that is that because artists go through this intense process, a process which I talk about in the book as vocation, they're intensely engaged with the nitty-gritty of the art form, whatever it is. Because of that, their work takes on a standalone power which has a particular place in the world. One of the things I talk about in the book, and it goes back to thinking that among ancient philosophers, is a distinction between making and doing. Doing is really being right out there in the world. Doing is being a politician. Doing is being a lawyer, helping somebody on death row, off death row. Doing is making a cake or making a meal that you eat for dinner. Doing is fixing a car so somebody could drive to work. Making often is thought of by philosophers as being something where you step away from the everyday doing and you make something. And you make something that has what I call a freestanding value. You may be talking about the cruelty of people to other people, but you're thinking about it and talking about it in a different way than the politician who tries to pass legislation addressing these problems, okay? And I think one of the things we sometimes lose track of, and especially in a time when many of us feel, and I certainly feel, that we're in kind of national and international emergencies on many social and political issues, one of the things I think we lose track of is the possibility of art to be powerful because it stands apart from the everyday push and pull. And, so even when, I was, a kid, a young man in the 60s and early 70s when protest music was so important. But the songs that we never forget, the ones we always went back to then, they don't only address the issues of the day, they also have what I would call this freestanding power. And by the same token, there are many works of art, a beautiful landscape, an abstract painting by Jackson Pollock or Mondrian, a string quartet by Mozart or Beethoven that you can't get the melodies out of your head. These things have no clear immediate relationship to anything in our lives, and yet we go to them, we feed on them in this deep way. And I think that's because, again, they exude this sense of an artist who has gone through this profoundly human struggle, kind of self-exploration, in which all the aspects of authority are engaged with as a free individual. There's a wonderful passage I quote in the book from the philosopher Isaiah Berlin where he talks about musicians, and he talks about like playing the violin, I believe is the example he gives. And he says, in order to master the violin, there's all this incredibly hard work involved. But the more you master the discipline, what I would call the authority of violin playing, the more freedom you feel. And I think, sometimes people think of freedom and authority as being like at loggerheads. But, to go back, Craig, to your example of the Constitution in America, that's also a good example of the Constitution is an authority that gives us our freedom, right? We have freedom within that authority. And I think that's what the arts do and what they show us in so many different ways.
You have also been known to be the authority on Alexander-Calder, and you wrote 2 volumes of biography on Calder. He's not addressed in the book, but I was just wondering, how do you see Calder living and working within this framework of authority and freedom?
That's a great question. And of course, Calder is somebody who took one of the kind of fundamentals of sculpture, which was sculpture is still, and asserted the freedom to make sculpture move. Now, he wasn't absolutely the first person to do that, but he explored this kind of possibility of free movement within sculpture with more energy and I would say depth than anybody of his day, and really anybody up until now. So there's this tremendous will to freedom, if you will, in Calder's work. But at the same time, I think Calder worries about very fundamental sculptural questions about how volume, mass, sculptural volume and mass intersect with space. And I think in his own way, sometimes you might say he presents a kind of negative of what sculpture was. In other words, not negative in a pejorative sense, but if sculpture was volume in the world, he, by making these small elements move through space, sort of underscores the idea of the void in sculpture, the space between the volumes. But I think he's very much engaged in a dialogue with the past and possibilities of a medium. Very, very definitely. And interestingly, more and more in his later years, when he's working on this monumental scale for public works that are now all over this country and all over the world, really, he goes back to non-mobile works, what he called the stabiles. And there, he's very much interacting with earlier traditions of public sculpture. You know, Calder's father, and actually his paternal grandfather also, both his father and his paternal grandfather were very well-known sculptors known for their large public works. And I think it's very definitely true that Calder's later large public works, perhaps the greatest being Flamingo in Chicago, a big red sculpture surrounded by three beautiful dark blackish, grayish buildings by Misandro. A work like that is, I think, his kind of free response to the authority of the public sculpture tradition in which both his father and his paternal grandfather worked.
In that time, it was a real shock to the sensibilities, to especially, I guess, the public, because, you know, people who work in those buildings or who live in, you know, Chicago, they are being invited to interact with these forms every day, and they had never seen something like that in public sculpture. If anything, it would have been relegated to its place in a museum, but it kind of shifted the way people thought about public sculpture, right?
Right. You're making a very important point. One of the things I hadn't realized before I was working on Calder's later years was how much pushback there was about abstract public sculpture in the 1960s. There's a fascinating story in the second volume of my Calder biography about Lincoln Center, which opens in the 60s, and an abstract Calder was one of the works that the people planning the outside spaces, the plazas around Lincoln Center, an abstract sculpture by Calder was one of the works that was planned. It was actually being paid for by a private donor. The head of the New York Parks Commission in the 60s, and the Parks Commission had some say over what went in those public spaces in Lincoln Center. The head of the Parks Commission was opposed at that point to having abstract sculpture in public spaces. So, yeah, it was a battle initially, and it was an evolution. And some of the most important Calders in public places actually were mounted in Europe, not in the U.S., and it took a while for the U.S. to catch on. And you're right, for the public, it was a kind of growing experience. And interestingly enough, Calder and a lot of his friends among the architects had a particular interest in the possibility of abstract public sculpture as being a kind of new symbol of democratic society and democratic experience. Because a number of Calder's friends wrote about the old public sculpture, which is, a guy on a horse or something. And they said, those sculptures have this very specific meaning. It's so-and-so on a horse who won such and such a battle, something like that. And they said, what a democratic society needs is public art that gives the citizen more freedom to think and see and perceive freely. And that was indeed Calder's idea behind these public sculptures. But as you say, Craig, it took a while for people to kind of begin to really understand what he was about and what public abstract sculpture was all about.
Well, Jed, I really appreciate your time today. This book, Authority and Freedom, A Defense of the Arts, and then interested guests to the podcast can find your 2 volumes on the life and work of Alexander Calder. Do you have another book on the horizon? Are there ideas?
Oh, I have thoughts, but I'm going to keep them to myself for the moment.
Right. And so if folks wanted to keep track of your work, where's the best place for people to follow up and get updates on you and your work and your writing?
Well, the place I'm most frequently writing for essays and stuff is the New York Review of Books. That's really where my byline appears. So if you just go to the New York Review of Books website and put in my name, you'll see recent articles that I've done, which on a variety, generally on the visual arts, but I also sometimes write there on other subjects as well.
Well, Jed, it's been a pleasure, and I really do appreciate your time today. And thank you for writing an insightful piece about arts, its role, and our active participation in it.
Well, thank you, Craig. It's really been a pleasure.
Now, the news. In 1976, African-American artist, scholar, and curator David Driscoll mounted a groundbreaking show at LACMA titled 2 Centuries of Black American Art. The monumental exhibition was critical in reevaluating the role of black artists that existed outside of or on the periphery of the art world's canon. The exhibit featured more than 200 pieces by 63 black artists, demonstrating that the work of these artists was being made, was significant, and yet was overlooked. Now, more than 45 years later, LACMA is hosting an exhibit envisioned as a sequel to Driscoll's 1976 show. Black American Portraits brings together more than 200 years of black portraiture by black artists. The chronological layout reminds us just how preciously few works fit the criteria in the early 1800s, versus the exhibit's contemporary crescendo, which features the works of artists like Barclay L. Hendricks, Amy Sherald, Kehinde Wiley, and Michelin Thomas. The exhibition is on view now through April 17th. In last week's episode, we spoke at length about catalog raisonnés, specifically that of Jackson Pollock. This week, there is news of the catalog raisonné of artist Marston Hartley needing to be updated after the discovery of a missing painting in a bank box in Portland, Maine. The painting, titled A Friend Against the Wind, was completed in 1936 to commemorate Canadian friends of the artist who had died during a hurricane. The collector had purchased the painting back in the 80s, but had moved the piece to the bank vault fearing the theft of the work. When the heirs found the piece, they reached out to the art historian Gail Scott, who had been working on the catalog. It turns out that Scott had tried to contact this particular collector about the work, but her messages had gone unanswered. Turns out her messages had been sent just